We all have gathered here on the occasion of IASFM14. Calcutta Research Group is proud to host it and is grateful to the IASFM for placing trust upon it to host the conference in Kolkata. In fact, for the first time in South Asia. In deciding to organize the event in South Asia, I take it that the IASFM recognizes the gravity of the situation of forced migration in this region. The fundamental rightlessness of the victims of forced migration here. Also, I take it as a recognition of the work that human rights activists, scholars, thinkers, and public policy makers in the countries of this region have done towards addressing the issue. Calcutta Research Group is a part of that community. Therefore, on behalf of not only the Calcutta Research Group, but also all the South Asian colleagues present here, I welcome you all to the 14th conference of the IASFM. I am sure the deliberations in the conference will go a long way in enriching our understanding of this great issue that overwhelms the lives of millions in the world today. Also, we cannot forget for a moment that we are meeting in Kolkata, perhaps a city most devastated by partition in contemporary history. Migration began with the infamous partition killings and the all-round fear of violence that forced out of the city, inasmuch as it had to accommodate even many more thousands of shelter seekers in the city. From its beginning, migrants have come in thousands to the city. In 1971, shelter seekers from Bangladesh came in millions. Calcutta, now known as Kolkata, remains the ultimate city of the migrants. Through organizing this event, we are paying tribute to its history, as well as its inner resolve and expanse of heart. This is what a post-colonial city should be proud of. I hope you will all try to take some time off from your schedule of stay here to get some glimpse of this ultimate migrant city. Speaking of our post-colonial destiny, I wish to make some comments which I hope will be relevant for the conference here. The forced migration problem, at least in the present time of history, is a post-colonial problem. And only a post-colonial orientation will enable us to understand its complexities, gravity, various dimensions, and the coping strategies that the victims of forced migration take. This calls for a more holistic approach to the issue. When around the mid-90s I began in my small way forced migration studies, I was of course aware of bonded labor, indentured labor, village to city migration of labor in forms of servitude, etc. In short, the various forms in which the forced comes into play, and I did not take up refugee studies as a separate field of research. Forced migration was, it appeared from the beginning, a much more holistic concept. I recall at the IASFM conference in Cairo, Professor B.S. Chimney made this important point. In course of appreciating his insights, I commented there that refugee studies scholars are a bit late in recognizing this. In some sense, CRG began its research with research on forced migration and has negotiated various binds and corners in the process. I believe the work of CRG and others has now enabled us to see the interconnections between various forms of force. The reason for this realization is that only with a post-colonial sense of history we can move on from the old, restricted, may I say, northern way of looking at things to the broader, more historical political way of looking at the phenomenon of forced migration. A critical post-colonial approach means a certain way of chronicling and analyzing various forms of forced migration, which is to say, being informed by a strong sense of history, awareness of the distinct nature of post-colonial politics and society, and an appreciation of the migrant and the refugee appearing as the subject of history of our time that is marked by the return of an empire. CRG has tried to mark its own works with collaborative research, critical post-coloniality, and a strong sense of the significance of the local in this globalizing time. Its report voices brought out the significance of camp as a liminal space of subjectivity and submission, of control and escape, despair and inefficacy of international norms, laws, and arrangements, and brought out the IDP's own voices about how and what could be done. All in all, one can say that forced migration studies has come out of the restrictive framework of refugee studies and has evolved to embrace many other aspects of migration and has now entered a critical post-colonial phase. Since Kolkata is always recalled in our time as a city of suffering, the worst of partition massacres, it will not be out of context to speak on this point. The 20th century will be remembered as a century of partitions. Partition leads to forced migration, refugee flows and flows of other types. Partition also makes the question of return crucial. Do partition refugees have right to return? If they have right of return, then what is the period they will enjoy the right? Also, will there be certain conditions placed upon return inasmuch as we know that there may be forced return? Partition is the prism in which the stakes in the study of forced migration become sharper. But there is a danger also. Partition scholars take post-partition migration to be a unique process and ignore the possibility that post-partition migration can be built on lines of historical continuity, and it is important to find out the continuities and the discontinuities in the process, and if necessary, take a comparative approach. Do we study, for instance, the nature of forced migration in Europe in their century of religious wars and compare that with what happened in India when the great religious war broke out in the second half of the 40s of the last century? Can we compare again, as an instance, the subjectivity evoked in Bertolt Brecht's Mother Courage and Sadat Hussein Monto's Toba Teksin? I believe we are still to appreciate the stakes in studying partition as a major marker in forced migration studies. Partition of the Ottoman Empire, of Germany, Palestine, and Korea in the last century, to name a few, or the Indian partition, these are only some of the major events to shape the story of forced migration today. These histories of partition-induced migration also demonstrate the indelible link between the figure of the citizen and the alien. Partitioned independence is always double-faced. The citizen exists in the alien as the savage form. Citizen is the articulate, the alien is inaudible, silent. To understand this life world of visibility and shadow, forced migration studies will have to adopt the strategy of interrogating alterity. In the plenary panels here we have organized for this conference, we have put emphasis, besides the issue of partition, the question of development-induced IDPs. In India, we cannot exaggerate the importance of this issue, apart from the fact that IDP issue has been of singular significance to forced migration studies. While there is some truth in the observation that IDPs are another governmental category and a creation of the policy world, I think that by focusing on the IDPs, we are now able to link issues of nation, sovereignty, economy, globalization, social violence, developmental issues in a more meaningful way. Recognition of the rights of the IDPs is the collective product of decades of struggles of population groups trying to survive. It is strange that very few big names in refugee studies care to see displacement in a broad light or do substantial research on IDP issues. Also, this is a situation where old forms of refugee status determination do not make much sense in this new condition. Old guarantees of asylum likewise do not make sense in the light of preventing strategies world over like Fortress Europe. Also, how does one distinguish between a classic refugee, a person escaping hunger and in search of work by any means and anyhow, and say traffic labor in servitude, rights are to remind ourselves indivisible. In this situation, a more dialogic relationship is necessary. Also, we have to struggle for minimizing, if we cannot do away altogether, the hold of security-related thinking, provisions and practices in matters of recognizing and protecting the rights of the victims of forced migration. Institutions have their vested interests, their domains. To try to reduce them is the need of the hour. To do so, we have to begin with working out and formulating the consequences of the theoretical recognition that population flows are massive and mixed. The reality of these mixed and massive flows questions old polarities. They need to be recognized in their variety, plurality, and amorphous nature. And this is possible only when we have a more federal way of looking at things, not from an institutional pyramid point of view from the top, but from the point of understanding how it works on the ground. We shall then be able to challenge the customary distinction between refugee studies and forced migration studies, and episodic violence and structural violence in terms of protection policies and institutions. This is possible only when we consider forced migration studies not as an isolated discipline or a subject defined by some strange esoteric rules, but as a field marked by lines of power and flight paths of various subjectivities. To work with that awareness, we require not only a sense of rights and responsibilities, but some sort of political awareness of the way in which the migrant appears in our civilized societies as abnormal. Interrogating the production of abnormality in the figure of the migrant has to be the main research concern. All these are additionally relevant when we recognize the current time as one of the return of primitive accumulation, when footloose labor becomes the ubiquitous figure of abnormality in the society of the settled and the propertied. As we all know, the 1951 Convention is dated for all kinds of reasons. The Cold War perspective is long over. The nature of forced migration has changed. New forms of servitude has appeared along with new vulnerabilities. The 1951 Convention also does not address the issue of burden sharing. Yet, as we know this too, that no one wants to open the can lest the worms should come out. Likewise, the guiding principles emphasize only a particular context of conflict and leaves out, on the whole, development-induced displacement. It places the issue of displacement in the framework of what is known today as sovereignty as responsibility. While the guiding principles have done service to the cause of the displaced population groups, yet it has left open many occasions for abuse. Without taking away anything from the merits of these principles, there has to be a different way from the one adopted in these principles that seem to focus on responsibility without recognizing the discriminatory history of responsibility. Yet, the modality of guiding principles is significant and has dialogic potentiality. It offers new insights into the process of lawmaking. If we take 1951 Convention, we can see the reason for its wide acceptance. It created a legal person of the refugee, a whole penumbra of institutions, an office, etc., without making anyone in nation, government, big powers, individual responsible for creating refugeehood. It was able to merge in a milieu of fantasy the ethics of humanitarian protection and guarantee of the rights of an escapee. The law thus succeeded. Likewise, the guiding principles are not law, yet they have the appearance of some kind of moral injunction with at least the partial effectiveness of law. So countries may not have signed the principles, they are only a resolution, yet they appear as giving birth to some kind of law. How do we retain this fantasy and proceed? My view is that not only we need to move on to the regional level as the most crucial level in framing the international, but there too we shall have to innovate the art of successful lawmaking by combining the fantasy with what we call injunction. The art of governmentality, in short, will never cease to be relevant. It is a process which is getting more and more intriguing. How to produce consent for a treaty is a serious problem for what we consider to be the domain of the international. Perhaps the more we shall decentralize the process, the more we shall produce the consent necessary for law. After all, we may not need grand and universal laws like the 51 Convention anymore, or at least not to the extent to which we are led to believe. We need more work on the process of producing the consensus at different levels and making that work. I am in that sense a believer in legal pluralism in things like this. Dialogue is ethics. The ethical practices of care and protection, to the extent they are there in the legal mechanisms for the protection of the displaced persons, are like a double-edged sword. They strengthen the principles of humanitarianism, which we need in our individual and collective lives. Yet when applied, they tend to reduce the person they seek to protect and care for to being objects of care and charity. Also, people may say, perhaps rightly, that whatever protection people have got is not due to principles of care and hospitality, but through struggle for rights. How is basic rightlessness removed? Derrida argued in a profound way that while the principle of care and hospitality is unavoidable, yet we care only to the extent self-care allows. Thus, there is always a limit to the care that these international legal mechanisms offer. At times, a great power will bomb a country, create refugees, displace millions, and then the so-called international community will invoke the principles of care to rush it in those bombed out countries and help the displaced within the limits set by the big power. That is why, please understand, people in war-ravaged countries sometimes despise the humanitarian workers, many of whom are perhaps inspired with noblest of values, yet get represented as the ones who have come to supply, as in Kashmir, artificial legs in the evening after their legs have been cut off in the morning on the order of a tyrant. Humanitarianism is an ideology that works like a machine. We begin with sentiments, we create institutions to give effect to those sentiments, and then we legitimize those institutions with an overarching ideology of care, which often glosses over the injustices of the entire process through which persons have been reduced to being objects of care and protection. Hence, we often hear the question of agency, and in any case, a large number of displaced millions on earth, possibly the majority of the displaced persons, do not depend upon these legal arrangements. Care operates in the lives of the millions in a different way. We can see this paradox even in the legal and administrative mechanisms for the protection of the displaced in India. There is no one single arrangement. Care of the displaced due to violence is organized along one line or set of lines, while care of the displaced due to developmental activities runs along another set, while again care of the displaced due to natural disasters is organized in a different set of ways. There are similarities in these three cases, yet the principle of care operates in a differential way. Humanitarianism in the 19th century was for the destitute, the abnormal, the poor in the colonies. Now it is for the displaced and the migrant, the abnormal subject of our time. Yet I believe we cannot do away with the principle of care. Federalization of care is important. Likewise important is the task of making dialogic the principles of care and protection. This requires the insertion of the principle of justice, which will bring back the issues of claims and rights. We thus cannot avoid the contradiction between care and rights. Only a sense of justice can make us more caring. The evolution of the jurisprudence on disability rights in India shows how a sense of justice can lead to a more caring approach. These are some introductory thoughts, inadequate in the context of the great variety of issues to be discussed in the coming 3 days. Once again, our thanks to the IASFM for asking us to host its 14th conference here. Please feel free to bring to our notice any issues that need to be redressed towards making the IASFM 14 a success. CRG is a public platform for research on issues of human rights and justice. It is not a professional organization, nor a core-funded body. It does not enjoy governmental institutional support. The conference is being hosted with public support of several educational and participatory research institutions. Since CRG lives precariously in the field of production of knowledge, we found that the only way to host the conference of this august body was to federalize the support base. We are glad that we have a large number of co-hosts. On behalf of CRG and all co-hosts, we take immense pleasure in welcoming you to Kolkata. Lastly, one of our scheduled inaugural speakers, Professor Sandro Mezzadra from Bologna University, Italy, could not come. We have made arrangements for distribution of copies of the text of his lecture. The text will be duly published in Refugee Watch. Thank you.
May I now request Chris Dolan to deliver the presidential address. Chris is the present president of IASFM.
Thank you, Paula. Friends and colleagues, on behalf of the entire Executive Committee of the International Association for the Study of Forced Migration, as well as the entire Conference Committee that has worked so impressively to bring us to this important post-colonial moment in forced migration studies, I would like to welcome you to Contested Spaces and Cartographic Challenges, the 14th conference of the IASFM. Those of you who participated in the previous conference, Governing Migration, will recall how we sought to do what Professor Samaddar has exhorted us to do here also, namely, to use the opportunity of an international conference